The earliest evidence of what would later be condemned as witchcraft in England emerges not from written records, but from the archaeological remnants of pre-Christian belief systems that permeated the British landscape long before. Roman legions crossed the Channel, or Christian missionaries established their first monasteries on windswept coastal promontories. The island that would become England harbored traditions of folk magic, healing practices, and supernatural belief that stretched back into the mists of prehistory, preserved in burial sites where bodies were interred with protective amulets, in the positioning of stones that marked sacred places where the boundary between the mortal world and the realm of spirits grew thin, and in the oral traditions that passed from generation to generation, knowledge of herbs that could cure illness, words that could bless crops, and rituals that could commune with forces beyond ordinary human perception. These practices existed within worldviews that recognized no sharp distinction between natural and supernatural causation, where illness might result equally from physical imbalance or spiritual transgression, where crop failure could stem from poor weather or divine displeasure, and where the wise woman who knew healing herbs and the cunning man who could find lost objects occupied respected positions within their communities, rather than facing persecution as servants of evil. The archaeological evidence from Anglo-Saxon burial sites reveals the complexity of these pre-Christian belief systems through grave goods that included items clearly intended to provide protection against malevolent supernatural forces, including iron knives placed in graves to ward off spirits, stones inscribed with protective symbols whose meanings have been lost to time, and careful positioning of bodies that suggests ritual practices designed to ensure safe passage to the afterlife or prevent the dead from walking. The Anglo-Saxon worldview that dominated England from the 5th century through the Norman conquest in 1066 incorporated a sophisticated understanding of supernatural causation that recognized multiple categories of spiritual beings and magical practitioners, including the use of terms like Witchcraft that referred to practices of magic and divination without the exclusively negative connotations that would later attach to witchcraft, and acknowledgement of both beneficial and harmful forms of supernatural intervention in human affairs. The conversion of Anglo-Saxon England to Christianity, beginning with Augustine's mission to Kent in 597 and proceeding gradually across the various kingdoms over the following centuries, did not immediately eliminate these traditional beliefs and practices, but rather initiated a long process of accommodation, synthesis, and eventual condemnation that would span nearly a millennium. Early medieval Christian authorities in England faced the practical challenge of converting populations whose daily lives were deeply embedded in traditional belief systems and magical practices, leading to policies that sometimes attempted to Christianize existing practices by associating them with saints and Christian rituals, sometimes tolerated them as harmless folk customs, and sometimes condemned them as demonic deceptions requiring punishment and correction. The Penitential of Theodore, compiled in the late 7th century by Theodore of Tarsus, Archbishop of Canterbury, provides crucial evidence for understanding early medieval English attitudes toward magical practices through its detailed catalogue of penances prescribed for various forms of forbidden behavior, including specific punishments for those who practiced divination, made offerings at forbidden sites, or consulted with those who claimed magical powers. Yet the relatively mild nature of these penances, typically involving periods of fasting and prayer rather than severe physical punishment or execution, suggests that ecclesiastical authorities viewed such practices more as errors requiring correction than as existential threats to Christian society. The laws of Anglo-Saxon kings similarly addressed magical practices within broader frameworks of maintaining social order and Christian piety, with the laws of King Alfred the Great in the late 9th century prescribing death for women who practiced harmful magic. Yet the rarity of recorded executions for such offences suggests that this legal provision functioned more as deterrent than as regularly enforced punishment. While the laws of later Anglo-Saxon kings like Ethelred and Knut continued to condemn various forms of magic and divination, while emphasizing their incompatibility with Christian faith, rather than treating them primarily as criminal acts requiring systematic prosecution. The Norman conquest in 1066 brought England into closer contact with continental European ecclesiastical culture and legal traditions that would eventually influence the development of witch prosecution. Yet the immediate post-conquest period witnessed no dramatic intensification of concern about magical practices or witchcraft, as Norman rulers focused primarily on consolidating political control and managing the integration of Norman and Anglo-Saxon administrative and legal systems. The High Medieval period, spanning roughly from the 11th through 13th centuries, saw gradual development of more systematic theological frameworks for understanding magic and demonic intervention in human affairs, as scholastic theologians working in the new universities at Oxford and Cambridge engaged with classical philosophical texts and patristic theological writings to develop more elaborate theories about the nature of demons, the limits of natural causation, and the mechanisms through which supernatural forces could affect the material world. These theological developments, however, remained largely confined to elite intellectual circles and had limited immediate impact on how ordinary English people understood and responded to accusations of harmful magic in their communities, where traditional patterns of informal social regulation continued to govern most disputes involving suspected magical harm. The medieval English legal system addressed harmful magic primarily through existing frameworks for dealing with murder, assault, and property damage, rather than treating witchcraft as a distinct category of crime, requiring specialized prosecution, with accusers who claimed injury from magical means, bearing the burden of proof and facing potential punishment for false accusation if they could not substantiate their claims, while those convicted of causing harm through magical means typically face punishments calibrated to the severity of injury caused, rather than automatic death sentences based on the supernatural nature of the alleged offense. The medieval English church court system, which exercised jurisdiction over matters of faith and morals, occasionally prosecuted individuals for practices deemed heretical or superstitious. Yet these cases typically involved relatively mild punishments, such as public penance and promises to abandon forbidden practices, rather than the severe sanctions that would characterize later witch trials, reflecting both the limited coercive power of church courts in medieval England and the continued perception of most magical practices as errors of judgment or faith, rather than as fundamental threats to Christian order. The Black Death's arrival in England in 1348 and its recurring outbreaks through the later 14th century created social and psychological conditions that might have been expected to intensify accusations of malevolent magic and witchcraft. As desperate populations sought explanations for catastrophic mortality and identified scapegoats who might be blamed for unleashing divine punishment or demonic forces. Yet the historical record reveals no significant spike in witch prosecutions during this period, suggesting that English society's frameworks for understanding disease, causation, and responding to epidemic crisis remained largely separate from concerns about witchcraft and demonic conspiracy. The 15th century witnessed gradual changes in continental European attitudes toward witchcraft that would eventually influence English developments, particularly the growing tendency among some theologians and inquisitors to link various forms of magical practice with explicit pacts with demons, and to imagine witches as members of organized conspiracies dedicated to serving Satan and undermining Christian society. Ideas crystallized most influentially in the Malleus Maleficarum, published in 1486 by German inquisitors Heinrich Kramer and Jacob Sprenger, which provided detailed theoretical framework for understanding witchcraft as demonic conspiracy and practical guidance for prosecuting suspected witches. The Malleus Maleficarum and similar continental texts gradually became known to English ecclesiastical and legal authorities through the international circulation of scholarly works and through English scholars' contacts with continental universities and religious institutions. Yet these ideas encountered resistance and skepticism in England that limited their immediate influence on English law and prosecution practices, as English legal traditions emphasized empirical evidence and witness testimony rather than the more inquisitorial procedures and theoretical presumptions that characterized witch prosecution in some continental regions. The Tudor period, beginning with Henry Tudor's victory at Bosworth Field in 1485 and his accession to the throne as Henry VII, brought significant transformations to English political, religious, and legal institutions that would create conditions for more systematic prosecution of witchcraft. Though these changes developed gradually, rather than marking immediate rupture with medieval patterns, Henry VIII's break with Rome and the establishment of the Church of England in the 1530s initiated religious upheavals that would continue through the reigns of Edward VI, Mary I, and Elizabeth I, as England oscillated between Protestant and Catholic religious policies, creating social tensions, theological uncertainties, and concerns about heresy and religious subversion that influenced how authorities and ordinary people understood threats to social and spiritual order. The Henrician Reformation's assault on traditional Catholic devotional practices, including the suppression of monasteries, the removal of images from churches, and the prohibition of various forms of popular religious observance, disrupted established patterns of seeking supernatural protection and assistance, as people who had previously sought help from saints' relics, blessed water, or prayers to particular saints, now faced the question of where to turn for supernatural aid in contexts where such Catholic practices were forbidden, but Protestant alternatives remained underdeveloped. The theological vacuum created by the Reformation's destruction of Catholic supernatural infrastructure may have intensified popular recourse to cunning folk and magical practitioners who offered services like finding lost objects, identifying thieves, healing illness through charms and herbs, and providing protection against malevolent magic. Even as Protestant authorities grew increasingly concerned about such practices as remnants of Catholic superstition or dangerous commerce with demonic forces. The reign of Edward VI, from 1547 to 1553, saw England's first statute, specifically addressing witchcraft as a secular crime, as Parliament passed the Witchcraft Act of 1542, which made it felony to invoke evil spirits for any purpose, to practice witchcraft, enchantment, or sorcery, to discover lost or stolen goods, or to use magical means to harm persons or property, prescribing death as penalty for some offences and imprisonment for others, though the Act's practical impact appears limited, given the brief duration of Edward's reign and its repeal under Mary I. Mary's restoration of Catholicism during her reign, from 1553 to 1558, reversed many Protestant religious policies and temporarily eliminated the statutory framework for witchcraft. Prosecution. As her government focused on prosecuting Protestant heresy rather than magical practices, though concerns about harmful magic and supernatural malevolence persisted at local levels regardless of national religious policies. Elizabeth I's accession in 1558 initiated the Elizabethan religious settlement that established lasting Protestant foundations for the Church of England, while attempting to accommodate moderate Catholics and suppress more radical Protestants, creating a context of continuing religious tension and anxiety about subversion that influenced the development of witchcraft prosecution. The Elizabethan Witchcraft Act of 1563 represented Parliament's renewed attempt to address witchcraft through secular criminal law, prescribing death for using witchcraft, enchantment, or sorcery to kill persons, and imprisonment for causing bodily harm, destroying property, or attempting to discover stolen goods through magical means, while also criminalizing the possession of books or instruments of witchcraft and the consulting of witches or cunning folk for various purposes. The 1563 Act's provisions reflected both genuine concern about harmful magical practices and Protestant authorities' desire to suppress recourse to magical services that competed with proper Christian prayer and divine providence. As Protestant theology emphasized that Christians should seek help only through legitimate prayer to God, rather than through magical rituals or consultations with spiritual intermediaries, whether Catholic saints or cunning folk claiming magical powers, the enforcement of the 1563 Act during Elizabeth's reign remained relatively restrained compared to both continental European witch hunting and the prosecution levels that England would experience in the earlier 17th century, with total executions for witchcraft during Elizabeth's 45-year reign probably numbering fewer than 100 persons, a modest figure compared to the thousands executed in some German territories during comparable periods, suggesting that English legal culture, religious policies, and social conditions produced distinctive patterns of witchcraft prosecution that differed significantly from continental developments. The relatively limited scale of Elizabethan witch prosecution reflected multiple factors, including the English legal system's reliance on jury trials that required convincing ordinary men of defendants' guilt rather than inquisitorial procedures that gave judges greater discretionary authority, the common law tradition's emphasis on specific evidence of harmful acts rather than theoretical frameworks about demonic conspiracy, skepticism among some English authorities about continental witch-hunting theories and practices, and perhaps greater social stability in England compared to regions experiencing more intense religious warfare and political fragmentation. The Elizabethan period did witness several significant witchcraft cases that revealed patterns and concerns that would characterize later English witch prosecution, including the trial of Agnes Waterhouse and her daughter Joan in 1566 at Chelmsford in Essex, representing one of the first prosecutions under the 1563 Act, and involving accusations that Agnes had kept a familiar spirit in the form of a cat named Satan that she fed with drops of her own blood and commanded to harm neighbors' livestock and children. Allegations that introduce themes of familiar spirits and demonic pacts that would become central to English witchcraft cases. The St. Osyth prosecutions in Essex in 1582 involved more than 10 women accused of witchcraft, following the alleged bewitching of a young woman and subsequent investigations that spread through local communities, resulting in executions of several convicted witches and revealing how accusations could proliferate through networks of suspicion once initial charges gained credibility, as accused witches implicated others during interrogations and investigations, while frightened neighbors reinterpreted past misfortunes as evidence of magical harm. The publication of A Rehearsal, both strange and true, of heinous and horrible acts committed by Elizabeth Style in 1579, provided one of the earliest English pamphlets describing witchcraft trials and helping to popularize ideas about witches' activities and characteristics, including accounts of familiar spirits, meetings with the devil, and specific malevolent acts, contributing to the development of a shared cultural vocabulary for understanding and identifying witchcraft that would influence both popular beliefs and legal proceedings. The Windsor witchcraft trials of 1579 involved accusations against 4 women from Windsor and surrounding areas who were charged with murdering persons through witchcraft and consulting with familiar spirits, resulting in executions that garnered attention partly through their proximity to royal residences and partly through published accounts that emphasized the sensational aspects of the allegations, including claims that the accused witches had dug up corpses from graves to use in magical rituals and had caused deaths and illnesses to numerous neighbors through their malevolent magic. These Elizabethan cases established patterns that would characterize much English witchcraft prosecution, including the prominence of female defendants, as roughly 90% of accused English witches were women, reflecting both the gendered nature of certain types of interpersonal conflict and caregiving roles that could give rise to witchcraft suspicions and broader cultural assumptions about women's supposed greater susceptibility to demonic influence and their association with forms of power that operated outside formal patriarchal structures. The types of harm typically attributed to witches, in English cases, centered on agrarian and domestic misfortunes that reflected the concerns of rural and small-town communities, including mysterious deaths or illnesses of children and livestock, spoilage of food, failure of dairy production, and various forms of household and agricultural disruption, rather than the more exotic allegations of night flying, shape-shifting, and attendance at demonic sabbaths that featured prominently in some continental cases. The English emphasis on familiar spirits as intermediaries between witches and the devil represented a distinctive feature of English witchcraft belief that differentiated it from Scottish and continental patterns as English accusers and prosecutors frequently focused on allegations that witches kept familiar spirits in the forms of cats, dogs, toads, or other creatures that they fed with their own blood drawn from special marks on their bodies called witches' teats, and that they dispatched to harm enemies or accomplish various magical tasks, creating a form of witchcraft accusation that linked everyday observations of women, keeping cats or other animals, with demonic conspiracy theories. The social dynamics underlying many English witchcraft accusations reflected patterns of neighborhood conflict and charity denial that anthropologists and historians have identified as characteristic of early modern community relations, as accusations often emerged after a poor woman requested assistance or goods from a better-off neighbor, was refused, made some statement that could be interpreted as a curse or threat, and then some misfortune befell the refusing neighbor or their family, leading the neighbor to retrospectively interpret the poor woman's earlier visit and words as magical cursing and to accuse her of witchcraft. These patterns suggest that witchcraft accusations served multiple social and psychological functions, including providing explanations for misfortunes that might otherwise seem random or inexplicable, enabling communities to identify and punish individuals who violated social norms or expectations, allowing accusers to displace guilt about their own failures of Christian charity by reframing poor neighbors as malevolent witches rather than unfortunate supplicants, and creating mechanisms for resolving tensions and restoring order in communities lacking more formal dispute resolution systems. The end of Elizabeth's reign in 1603 and the accession of James, the Sixth of Scotland, as James I of England, brought to the English throne a monarch with intense personal interest in witchcraft and demonic conspiracy, as James had been personally involved in the North Berwick witch trials in Scotland in the early 1590s, had written a treatise on demonology, published in 1597, that expounded sophisticated theoretical framework for understanding witchcraft as demonic conspiracy requiring vigorous prosecution, and viewed himself as special target of witches' malevolence due to his role as godly Protestant monarch, defending true religion against satanic subversion. James's Daemonology, written partly in response to Reginald Scott's skeptical discovery of witchcraft, published in 1584, which had questioned the reality of witches' supposed powers and criticized witch prosecution as based on delusion and credulity, provided detailed taxonomy of various types of supernatural beings and magical practitioners, instructions for identifying witches through their marks and their inability to recite the Lord's Prayer correctly, and theological justification for aggressive prosecution of witchcraft as necessary defense of Christian society against demonic assault. The arrival of a monarch so committed to reality of witchcraft and necessity of its prosecution might have been expected to inaugurate a period of intensified witch hunting in England, yet the first decades of the 17th century saw relatively modest increases in prosecution rates compared to the explosion of accusations and trials that would occur in the 1640s, suggesting that even royal enthusiasm for witch prosecution required supportive social conditions and institutional frameworks to translate into sustained campaigns against suspected witches. The Jacobean Witchcraft Act of 1604 replaced the Elizabethan statute with more severe provisions that prescribed death for practicing invocation or conjuration of evil spirits, for consulting with familiar spirits, for using dead bodies or parts of dead bodies in magical practices, and for harming persons through witchcraft, while also criminalizing various other forms of magical practice with lesser penalties, reflecting James's conviction that witchcraft represented serious threat to both individual victims and the godly commonwealth. The early Stuart period witnessed several significant witchcraft trials that illustrated both continuities with Elizabethan patterns and new developments that would characterize the coming decades of intensified prosecution, including the Lancashire witch trials of 1612, the most famous English witchcraft prosecutions prior to the Civil War era, which originated in accusations made by a young girl named Janet Device against her own grandmother, mother, and other family members. Allegations that spread to encompass some 20 accused witches from the Pendle forest area of Lancashire, culminating in trial at Lancaster, assizes where 10 defendants were convicted and hanged. The Pendle witch trials gained lasting fame partly through the detailed account preserved in Thomas Potts's The Wonderful Discovery of Witches in the County of Lancaster, published in 1613 with apparent official encouragement, which provided minute descriptions of the accusations, evidence, examinations, and trial proceedings that offered unprecedented insight into how witchcraft cases developed and were prosecuted in early Stuart England. Potts's narrative revealed the role that family conflicts and accusations could play in generating witchcraft cases, as the Device family's internal tensions and mutual accusations formed the core of the prosecutions, while also demonstrating how local officials' investigations and interrogations could transform initial complaints into elaborate narratives of demonic conspiracy, involving multiple suspects, familiar spirits, clay images used for harmful magic, and communal meetings of witches to plot mischief. The Lancashire trials also highlighted the evidential challenges that characterized English witchcraft prosecution, as convictions depended heavily on testimony from alleged victims about their sufferings and their certainty that specific individuals had bewitched them, on confessions obtained from defendants who may have been influenced by leading questions, exhaustion, or despair, and on testimony from other accused witches who implicated their supposed confederates, while physical evidence remained limited to discovery of supposed witches' marks, finding of clay images allegedly used in harmful magic, and observations of suspects' interactions with animals that might be familiar spirits. The Leicester Boy case of 1616 illustrated the dangers of false accusation and the skepticism with which some authorities viewed certain witchcraft claims. As a young boy named John Smith gained attention by claiming that he was tormented by witches and by performing dramatic fits and vomiting unusual objects when in presence of suspected witches, leading to prosecution of 9 women. But subsequent investigation revealed that the boy had been coached by adults with grudges against the accused women, and that his afflictions were feigned, resulting in his public exposure as fraud, and the release of most of the accused witches. The presence of skeptics and the possibility of demonstrated fraud did not eliminate witchcraft prosecution, but did create an environment in which accusations and evidence had to meet certain standards of plausibility to convince juries, judges, providing some protection against the most outlandish accusations, while still allowing prosecution of cases that seemed to meet evidentiary thresholds for criminal conviction. The Jacobean period also witnessed growing publication of witchcraft pamphlets, theological treatises, and accounts of trials that helped shape popular and elite understanding of witchcraft's nature and dangers, creating feedback loops between published ideas about witchcraft and actual accusations and prosecutions, as people who read or heard about witchcraft literature might become more alert to signs of witchcraft in their own communities, while also learning what types of evidence and accusations authorities expected to hear. The reign of Charles I from 1625 to his execution in 1649 spanned a crucial transition period in English witchcraft prosecution, as the relative stability of the 1620s and 1630s gave way to political and religious crisis in the 1640s that created conditions for the most intense phase of English witch hunting, including the notorious campaigns of Matthew Hopkins, the self-proclaimed Witchfinder General, that resulted in more executions for witchcraft in a few years than had occurred in the previous century of English prosecution. The crisis of the 1640s, encompassing civil war between royalist and parliamentary forces, the temporary abolition of bishops, and disruption of traditional church governance, intense religious controversy between competing visions of proper Reformed Christianity, Scottish invasion, and Irish rebellion that raised fears of Catholic conspiracy, and breakdown of normal legal and administrative structures in many regions, created social anxiety and institutional conditions that proved conducive to increased witchcraft accusations and prosecution. The collapse of effective assize court system in some regions during the civil wars, paradoxically, both reduced and intensified witchcraft prosecution, as the absence of regular assizes prevented some cases from reaching trial, while in other contexts, allowing local authorities to pursue cases without the oversight that circuit judges might have provided, while the general atmosphere of crisis and fear made populations more prone to see malevolent supernatural causes behind misfortunes, and more willing to take aggressive action against suspected sources of occult harm. The East Anglian witch hunt that began in 1645 and continued through 1647 represented the single most intense episode of witch prosecution in English history, resulting in executions of more than 100 persons, and involving accusations against several hundred individuals across Essex, Suffolk, and neighbouring counties. Prosecutions that were driven by the activities of Matthew Hopkins and his associate John Stern, who travelled through East Anglian communities, offering services as expert witchfinders capable of identifying witches through various techniques, including searching for witches' marks, testing suspects by watching them to see if familiar spirits appeared, and interrogating accused persons to obtain confessions and accusations against others. Hopkins's techniques, which included sleep deprivation of suspects, forced walking until exhaustion, and swimming of suspected witches by binding and throwing them into water to see if they would float, represented importation of methods that had been used in continental and Scottish witch hunting, but had not previously been systematically employed in England, suggesting that the extraordinary circumstances of Civil War era enabled prosecution methods that would not have been tolerated under normal legal oversight. The Hopkins trials produced lurid accounts of witches' activities that borrowed heavily from continental demonological literature, while adapting such material to English contexts, including claims that witches had made explicit pacts with the devil, who appeared to them in various forms, that they had attended meetings where they feasted and planned mischief, that they kept numerous familiar spirits with grotesque names and appearances, and that they had caused deaths and injuries to dozens of neighbours through their malevolent magic, accusations that went beyond the typical English pattern of attributing specific neighbourhood misfortunes to magical causation, and approached the more elaborate continental model of witchcraft as organised demonic conspiracy. The scale and severity of Hopkins's campaigns attracted criticism even during the 1640s, as skeptics questioned the legitimacy of his methods and the reliability of evidence obtained through his interrogations, with particular concern about the swimming test, which many authorities considered unlawful and theologically dubious, since it appeared to seek supernatural confirmation of guilt rather than relying on proper legal evidence, while the sheer number of accusations and executions strained credulity and local resources. Hopkins's published defence of his methods in The Discovery of Witches in 1647 attempted to answer critics by providing detailed justification for his techniques and evidence for witches' reality, but his witch-finding career ended that same year, possibly due to growing opposition from local authorities or his own ill health, and his death in 1648 removed the driving force behind East Anglian prosecutions, leading to rapid decline in cases and executions. The Hopkins episode's long-term significance lay partly in demonstrating the potential for witch hunting to escalate dramatically under particular combinations of social anxiety, disrupted normal oversight, and committed witchfinder willing to pursue cases aggressively, and partly in creating reaction against such excesses that would contribute to growing skepticism about witch prosecution in subsequent decades, as memory of Hopkins's campaigns influenced both popular and elite thinking about proper limits on witchcraft investigations. The interregnum period from Charles's execution in 1649 through the restoration of Charles II in 1660 witnessed continued witchcraft prosecutions, but at substantially reduced rates compared to the Hopkins years, suggesting that even the continued political and religious turmoil of the 1650s proved less conducive to witch hunting than the particular crisis conditions of the mid-1640s had been, while growing stability and established authority of Cromwellian regime may have reduced the social anxiety that fueled witchcraft accusations. The Maidstone witchcraft trial of 1652 involved prosecution of 6 women from Kent accused of bewitching persons and livestock, resulting in 5 convictions and executions that demonstrated continued official willingness to prosecute witchcraft cases, but also revealed emerging skepticism, as the presiding judge expressed doubts about some evidence, while ultimately allowing jury conviction based on testimony about victims' sufferings and suspects' supposed witches' marks. The Salisbury witchcraft panic of 1653 originated in accusations by a young woman who claimed to be tormented by witches and performed dramatic fits that convinced many observers of her genuine affliction, leading to arrests of several suspects. But investigation by local magistrates revealed inconsistencies in the accuser's testimony and evidence suggesting fraud, resulting in her prosecution for making false accusations rather than execution of the suspected witches, illustrating growing official caution about accepting dramatic accusations without careful scrutiny. The execution of witches at Maidstone in 1659 represented one of the last significant English witchcraft trials before the Restoration, with 4 women convicted of causing deaths through witchcraft, based primarily on testimony from alleged victims and their families about mysterious illnesses and deaths that followed conflicts with the accused women, evidence patterns that remained consistent with earlier English prosecution traditions, even as the theoretical frameworks and rhetorical justifications for witch hunting were beginning to shift. The restoration of Charles II in 1660 initiated a period of relative stability and growing rationalism that would prove increasingly inhospitable to witchcraft prosecution, though the immediate post-Restoration years saw continued cases and executions as traditional beliefs about witchcraft and its dangers persisted among both popular and some elite populations, despite emerging skepticism among natural philosophers, theologians, and legal authorities. The Royal Society's founding in 1660 and its promotion of experimental natural philosophy contributed to intellectual environment increasingly suspicious of supernatural causation, claims that could not be subjected to empirical investigation and replication. Though many fellows of the Royal Society remained convinced of witchcraft's reality, even while insisting that claims about specific instances required careful scrutiny and empirical verification. The trial and execution of Rose Cullender and Amy Duny at Bury St Edmunds in 1662 for bewitching children represented last major English witch trial to result in executions, with the case attracting significant attention due to the involvement of Sir Matthew Hale as presiding judge, a respected legal figure whose acceptance of witchcraft evidence seemed to validate prosecution even as skepticism grew in other quarters, and due to the dramatic testimony about children's afflictions that convinced the jury despite the purely testimonial nature of evidence against the accused women. The Bury St Edmunds trial's publication, an influential account by an observer, reinforced traditional beliefs about witchcraft's reality and the necessity of prosecution among readers who trusted Hale's judgment and found the evidence compelling. Yet the case also attracted criticism from skeptics who questioned whether the children's afflictions necessarily proved bewitchment by the specific accused women, and whether alternative explanations might account for the observed phenomena. The 1670s and 1680s witnessed continuing decline in witchcraft prosecutions as combination of factors, including growing elite skepticism, higher standards of evidence required by judges, greater reluctance of juries to convict in capital cases, and changing intellectual frameworks for understanding causation gradually eroded the social and institutional supports that had sustained earlier prosecution, though popular beliefs about witches and magical harm remained widespread in rural communities, where cunning folk continued to practice services like countermagic against suspected witches and healing through charms and herbs. The publication of Joseph Glanvill's Sadducismus Triumphatus in 1681 represented learned defense of witchcraft's reality against growing skepticism, as Glanville collected accounts of supposed supernatural phenomena and argued that denial of witchcraft's possibility led logically to atheism by undermining belief in spiritual realm generally. Yet the defensive nature of Glanville's arguments and the need to marshal evidence against skeptics indicated that belief in witchcraft could no longer be simply assumed, but required active intellectual defense. The case of Jane Wenham tried for witchcraft in 1612 at Hertford, illustrated both persistence of witchcraft prosecution into early 18th century and the changing attitudes that made conviction increasingly difficult. As Wenham was convicted by jury based on testimony about strange phenomena and afflictions allegedly caused by her magical activities. But the presiding judge, Justice Powell, clearly doubted the evidence and recommended pardon, which was granted, allowing Wenham to live out her remaining years supported by sympathetic patrons who rejected the witchcraft accusations. The Witchcraft Act of 1736 represented official recognition that witchcraft prosecution had become untenable in enlightened society by repealing the earlier witchcraft statutes and making it illegal to accuse persons of witchcraft, while criminalizing various forms of fortune-telling and conjuring under framework of fraud rather than demonic conspiracy, effectively declaring that the problem was not real witches, but rather charlatans who preyed on credulous believers or malicious accusers who used witchcraft charges to harm innocent persons. The 1736 Act did not end popular belief in witchcraft or the practice of folk magic, but did terminate the possibility of prosecuting witchcraft through the criminal courts, shifting such conflicts to realm of popular justice, including occasional mob violence against suspected witches, and continued consultation with cunning folk for protective magic, while the official legal system addressed only fraud by those claiming magical powers to deceive customers or extort money. The case of Ruth Osborne, killed by mob in 1651 in Hertfordshire, after being accused of witchcraft and subjected to swimming tests that drowned her, demonstrated that repeal of witchcraft laws did not immediately eliminate popular witch beliefs or prevent violent consequences for suspected witches, as local communities might take justice into their own hands when official channels refused to address perceived occult threats. The trial and execution of Thomas Colley for the murder of Ruth Osborne represented ironic reversal, as authorities prosecuted not the alleged witch, but rather her killer, sending message that witchcraft accusations would no longer be tolerated as justification for violence, and that popular witch beliefs must yield to enlightened rationalism, backed by legal authority. The 18th century witnessed gradual transformation of witchcraft from serious spiritual and criminal concern into subject of mockery, skepticism, and antiquarian interest among educated classes, though traditional beliefs persisted in rural areas, where isolation from urban intellectual culture and continued reliance on agriculture and animal husbandry maintained social conditions in which witchcraft accusations had traditionally flourished. The work of antiquarians and folklorists, who collected accounts of witchcraft beliefs and practices from rural informants, helped preserve record of traditional magical culture, even as such beliefs lost intellectual respectability, creating archives that would later prove valuable for historians and anthropologists, seeking to understand early modern popular beliefs and social practices. The Methodism's emergence in 18th century, under John Wesley's leadership, paradoxically included continued belief in demonic activity and supernatural intervention that stood in tension with Enlightenment rationalism, as Wesley's journals recorded accounts of supposed demonic possessions and supernatural phenomena that he interpreted as evidence for spiritual warfare between God and Satan, suggesting that even within innovative religious movements, the old cosmology of spiritual conflict and supernatural causation retained power among believers. The 19th century saw continued marginalization of witchcraft beliefs in respectable society as industrialization, urbanization, improved education, and scientific advancement created cultural conditions increasingly inhospitable to traditional magical worldviews. Yet the persistence of cunning folk offering magical services in rural areas into late Victorian period demonstrated the resilience of popular magical culture in communities where traditional social structures and agricultural economies remained largely intact. The prosecution of various individuals throughout the 19th century for fortune-telling and related offences under the 1736 Act indicated that authorities continued to concern themselves with suppressing magical practitioners, though now conceptualized as frauds exploiting credulous clients rather than as genuine wielders of demonic power. While the occasional instances of mob violence against suspected witches revealed that lethal witch beliefs had not entirely disappeared from English popular culture, despite their rejection by educated opinion. The Helen Duncan case during World War II represented curious epilogue to English witchcraft prosecution history, as Duncan, a spiritualist medium, was prosecuted under the 1736 Witchcraft Act in 1944 for fraudulent seances, with authorities apparently concerned that her activities might compromise wartime security if she revealed classified information about military operations that she could only have obtained through normal espionage rather than supernatural communication with the dead, leading to her conviction and imprisonment under statute, originally designed to prosecute demonic conspiracy, but now applied to fraudulent supernatural claims. The repeal of the 1736 Act in 1951 through the Fraudulent Mediums Act represented final legislative closure to formal witchcraft prosecution in England, as the new statute focused explicitly on fraud and deception, while abandoning even the nominal concern with supernatural practices that had characterized the earlier law, marking official recognition that the entire framework of witchcraft prosecution belonged to discarded past. The development of modern Wicca in mid-20th century England through the work of Gerald Gardner and others represented extraordinary transformation of witchcraft from condemned practice into new religious movement, claiming ancient roots and emphasizing goddess worship, nature, reverence, and magical ritual as positive spiritual practices, appropriating the historical term witchcraft, but investing it with meanings largely disconnected from the malevolent practices that had concerned early modern prosecutors and communities. Gardner's publication of Witchcraft, Today in 1954, and subsequent books presenting Wicca as survival of ancient pre-Christian pagan religion, initiated religious movement that would spread beyond England, influence global pagan and occult movements. Though scholarly analysis demonstrated that Gardner's claims about ancient origins were largely fictional, and that Wicca represented modern synthetic creation, drawing on various esoteric, folkloric, and romantic sources, rather than genuine continuation of historical witchcraft traditions. The growth of Wicca and related neo-pagan movements in late 20th century created ironic situation where witchcraft, once prosecuted as ultimate crime against God and society, became identity claimed by thousands of practitioners who viewed themselves as following nature-based spiritual path, emphasizing divine feminine, magical practice for personal growth and beneficial purposes, and ethical principles summarized in Wiccan Redder's injunction to harm none, transformation that would have been incomprehensible to both early modern witch prosecutors and the accused witches who denied practicing harmful magic. The academic study of English witchcraft history developed substantially in 20th century through work of historians like Keith Thomas, Alan McFarlane, and Robin Briggs, who applied anthropological methods, statistical analysis, and detailed archival research to understanding social dynamics, prosecution patterns, and belief systems that had characterized early modern witch hunting, moving beyond simplistic narratives about ignorance and superstition to recognize complexity of witchcraft accusations as expressions of social tensions, explanatory frameworks for misfortune, and mechanisms for community conflict resolution. The recognition that English witchcraft prosecution differed significantly from continental patterns in scale, character, and theoretical foundations highlighted importance of specific national and regional contexts in shaping witch hunting, as England's common law legal system, Protestant theology, relative political stability, and particular social structures produced distinctive form of witchcraft, concern that emphasized neighborhood conflicts and familiar spirits rather than elaborate demonic sabbaths and mass conspiracies. The feminist scholarship that emerged in later 20th century brought new attention to gendered dimensions of witchcraft prosecution, analyzing why women comprised overwhelming majority of accused witches and how accusations reflected patriarchal anxieties about women's power, female sexuality, and women who lived outside male control, though debates continued about whether witchcraft prosecution should be understood primarily as gender-based persecution, or whether other factors like age, poverty, and social marginality played equally important roles. The historiographical debates about witchcraft prosecution's causes and significance produced various interpretive frameworks, including emphasis on religious transformation and theological concerns about demonic conspiracy, analysis of social strain and community conflict in early modern villages, attention to legal changes that made prosecution more feasible, consideration of environmental and climatic stress that increased social tension, and recognition of witchcraft beliefs' functions in providing explanatory frameworks for misfortune and mechanisms for social control. The continued scholarly interest in English witchcraft history reflected both the intrinsic fascination of the subject and its value as lens for examining broader aspects of early modern English society, including gender relations, religious change, legal development, social structure, economic transformation, and the relationship between popular and elite cultures. The archaeological investigation of sites associated with witchcraft accusations and the scientific analysis of supposed witches' remains has provided material evidence complementing documentary sources, including discoveries of witch bottles buried in buildings to provide magical protection, concealed caches of objects that may have served magical purposes, and burial practices, suggesting communities' continued fear of dead witches' potential malevolence. The preservation and presentation of witchcraft history at museums and heritage sites throughout England has made this history accessible to broad public audiences, while raising questions about appropriate ways to commemorate episodes of persecution and to present complex historical phenomena without either trivializing the suffering of executed individuals or reproducing uncritical assumptions about witchcraft beliefs. The memory of English witchcraft history continues to resonate in contemporary English culture through literary treatments, historical fiction, tourist attractions at sites associated with famous trials, and ongoing debates about how to memorialize accused and executed witches, with some communities erecting monuments acknowledging past injustices, while others remain uncertain about appropriate forms of commemoration. The broader implications of English witchcraft history extend beyond the specific phenomenon of witch prosecution to illuminate fundamental questions about how societies identify and respond to perceived threats, how religious and scientific worldviews shape understanding of causation and evidence, how legal systems balance protection of communities against harm with protection of individuals against false accusation, and how social tensions and anxieties find expression through persecution of marginalized groups. The transformation of witchcraft from serious criminal concern in early modern England to historical curiosity and subject of neo-pagan religious innovation in contemporary England represents one of the most dramatic shifts in cultural meaning and social practice over the past 5 centuries, demonstrating how fundamentally ideas about supernatural power, demonic activity, and appropriate responses to perceived magical harm could change as intellectual frameworks, religious assumptions, legal structures, and social conditions evolved. The study of this transformation reveals not only facts about past beliefs and practices, but also insights into processes of cultural change, the relationship between elite and popular culture, the power of legal and religious institutions to define reality and enforce conformity, and the human tendency to seek explanations for suffering and misfortune through frameworks that identify responsible agents, whether natural, supernatural, or human. The English witchcraft prosecutions represented specific historical phenomenon produced by particular combinations of religious change, social tension, legal structures, and belief systems that prevailed during roughly 2 centuries of early modern English history. Yet the underlying human concerns about malevolent harm, the search for explanations of suffering, and the identification of scapegoats who might be blamed for community misfortunes reflect more universal patterns that appeared in different forms across various cultures and time periods. The relatively limited scale of English witch prosecution compared to some continental regions, with total English executions probably numbering between 500 and 1,000 persons across nearly 2 centuries, demonstrated that while England participated in broader European witch-hunting phenomenon, specific English conditions, including common law legal traditions, Protestant theology that emphasized divine sovereignty over demonic power, and relative political stability, limited the development of systematic witch-hunting campaigns that characterize some other regions. The concentration of English witchcraft prosecutions in eastern counties, particularly Essex, Suffolk, and Kent, reflected regional variations in social conditions, legal culture, and perhaps Puritan religious influence that made some areas more prone to witchcraft accusations and prosecution than others, while the relative scarcity of cases in northern and western regions suggested that different social structures, settlement patterns, or cultural traditions in those areas provided less fertile ground for witch hunting. The typical English witch was an older woman, often widowed or unmarried, frequently poor and dependent on neighbours' charity, sometimes with reputation for being difficult or quarrelsome, who lived in circumstances that made her vulnerable to witchcraft accusations. When neighbours who had denied her requests for assistance subsequently experienced misfortunes, they attributed to her magical retaliation pattern that reflected both gendered power dynamics and early modern communities' struggles with tension between Christian charity obligations and limited resources. The accusations against such women typically focused on specific harmful acts, like causing illness or death to children, livestock, or neighbours, rather than participation in abstract demonic conspiracies. And evidence consisted primarily of victims' testimony about their sufferings, combined with confessions that may have resulted from exhaustion, despair, actual belief in their own magical powers, or leading questions from interrogators. While physical evidence remained limited to supposed witches' marks, possession of objects, like clay images, that might be used in harmful magic, and observations of cats or other animals that might be familiar spirits. The role of cunning folk in English witchcraft cases was complex and ambiguous, as these magical practitioners offered services including finding lost or stolen objects, identifying witches responsible for misfortunes, providing counter-magic for protection against witchcraft, and healing through charms and herbs, occupying social position that was technically illegal under witchcraft statutes, but generally tolerated by authorities and widely used by ordinary people, while occasionally cunning folk themselves faced prosecution when their activities attracted official attention or when they became involved in conflicts that generated witchcraft accusations. The gendered nature of English witchcraft prosecution, with approximately 90% of accused witches being female, reflected multiple factors, including women's association with food preparation, healing, and childcare, that created opportunities for suspicions about magical harm in these domestic domains, cultural assumptions about women's greater susceptibility to demonic temptation, dating back to Eve's role in the fall, anxieties about women who lived outside patriarchal control as widows or never-married persons, and the ways that poverty and old age rendered women particularly vulnerable to accusations from neighbours with whom they had conflicts over charity or resources. The male witches who comprised minority of accused persons included cunning folk whose magical services attracted prosecution, men accused of witchcraft alongside female relatives or associates, and occasional individuals whose specific circumstances made them vulnerable to accusations. Despite their gender, though male witches typically faced prosecution patterns similar to female witches, with focus on neighborhood conflicts and specific harmful acts rather than distinctively gendered accusations. The children who sometimes appeared as accusers in English witchcraft cases played crucial roles in generating prosecutions through their testimony about alleged bewitchment and their dramatic fits or afflictions that convinced observers of genuine magical harm, raising questions about whether these children genuinely experienced the sufferings they described, whether they were coached by adults to make false accusations, whether they sought attention and power through their afflicted roles, or whether psychosomatic processes produced real symptoms that children and observers interpreted as evidence of bewitchment. The demographic profile of English witchcraft cases revealed significant patterns, including concentration in market towns and villages, rather than major cities or isolated rural areas, tendency for prosecutions to increase during periods of social and economic stress, correlation between accusation patterns and specific types of interpersonal conflict, particularly involving charity, denial, and geographical clustering that suggested local cultures of suspicion and accusation, where successful prosecutions in one case encouraged similar accusations in subsequent cases. The seasonal patterns of English witchcraft accusations showed some tendency for cases to emerge during late winter and early spring, when food supplies ran low and survival pressures intensified, creating conditions where conflicts over resources and mysterious deaths of children or livestock took on particular urgency and prompted searches for supernatural explanations and responsible agents who might be held accountable. The interaction between popular beliefs about witchcraft and elite demonological theories produced complex dynamics in English cases, as prosecutors and judges sometimes attempted to frame accusations according to theological frameworks about demonic pacts and conspiracy, while witnesses and accusers typically focused on specific neighborhood conflicts and observable harms, creating tension between theoretical sophistication and evidential reality that varied across different cases and jurisdictions. The role of confession evidence in English witchcraft trials remained controversial both during prosecutions and in subsequent historical analysis, as confessions obtained through exhausting interrogations, leading questions, sleep deprivation, or physical discomfort raised obvious questions about reliability, while confessions from some accused witches appeared to reflect genuine beliefs that they possessed magical powers or had made agreements with familiar spirits, suggesting complex psychological and social processes underlying confession production. The outcome patterns of English witchcraft trials demonstrated that accusation did not automatically lead to conviction and execution, as substantial proportions of accused witches were acquitted by juries, had charges dismissed by judges, or received non-capital punishments, indicating that English legal system's jury trial requirements and common law evidentiary standards provided some protection against witch-hunting excesses, though the mere fact of accusation and trial caused serious harm to defendants through imprisonment, legal costs, damage to reputation, and psychological trauma, regardless of final verdict. The social consequences of witchcraft accusations extended beyond individual accused witches to affect entire communities through generated fear and suspicion, disrupted social relationships, economic costs of prosecutions, and creation of precedents that could encourage subsequent accusations. While communities that experienced witchcraft prosecutions sometimes developed reputations as witch-prone areas that persisted in local memory and attracted continued attention from authorities and witch-finders. The comparative analysis of English witchcraft prosecution with Scottish and continental European patterns revealed significant variations in prosecution scale, evidential standards, torture usage, and theoretical frameworks, with England's relatively restrained prosecution reflecting multiple factors, including common law legal traditions, requiring jury conviction, official skepticism about some continental demonological theories, absence of routine judicial torture, and Protestant theology that emphasized divine providence over demonic power, while Scotland's much higher per capita prosecution rate demonstrated that sharing Protestantism and British political connection did not produce uniform witchcraft prosecution patterns. The relationship between Protestantism and English witchcraft prosecution remained complex, as Protestant emphasis on divine sovereignty and rejection of Catholic sacramental magic might have been expected to reduce witchcraft concerns by denying witches significant power, yet Protestant focus on struggle between God and Satan, concerns about remnants of Catholic superstition, and emphasis on Scripture's authority, including biblical injunctions against witchcraft, provided different frameworks supporting prosecution, while variations among different Protestant groups, from Anglicans to Puritans to Quakers, created diverse attitudes toward witchcraft that influenced prosecution patterns in areas where particular religious groups predominated. The intellectual developments that contributed to decline of English witchcraft prosecution included growth of mechanical philosophy and natural science that provided alternative explanatory frameworks for phenomena previously attributed to supernatural causation, philosophical skepticism about testimony, and evidence that raised standards for accepting extraordinary claims, theological arguments that questioned whether God would permit witches the powers attributed to them, and humanitarian concerns about justice and protection of innocent persons that made prosecution seem increasingly problematic. The economic and social transformations of later 17th and 18th century England, including increased social mobility, development of more formal poor relief systems, growth of commercial economy that reduced dependence on neighborhood reciprocity, and cultural changes that promoted politeness and emotional restraint in interpersonal conflicts, gradually undermined the social conditions that had sustained witchcraft accusations, as traditional patterns of neighborhood conflict and charity denial became less central to social relationships in increasingly commercial and bureaucratic society. The continued popular belief in witchcraft and magical harm, long after cessation of legal prosecution, demonstrated distinction between elite and popular culture, as educated classes adopted Enlightenment rationalism, while rural populations maintained traditional beliefs about supernatural causation. Cunning folk continued practicing magical services, and occasional instances of mob violence against suspected witches revealed persistence of lethal witch beliefs in some communities into 19th century. The transformation of cunning folk from tolerated, if technically illegal, magical practitioners into prosecutable frauds under 1736 Act, as concern moved from demonic power to commercial fraud, from supernatural threat to confidence games, from theological danger to consumer protection issue, reframing magical practitioners as criminals who deceived customers rather than as agents of Satan who wielded genuine occult powers. The preservation of memory about specific witchcraft cases varied considerably, with some trials like the Pendle witches achieving lasting fame through published accounts and local memory, while many other cases left minimal historical traces beyond brief legal records, creating uneven historical record that privileged sensational cases and those documented by literate observers, while obscuring more typical prosecutions that might better represent common patterns. The memorialization of executed witches in contemporary England has raised challenging questions about appropriate forms of remembrance, as some communities have erected plaques or monuments acknowledging historical injustices, while others debate whether such memorialization risks romanticizing executed individuals whose actual beliefs and practices remain obscure, or creating tourist attractions that trivialize past suffering. The use of English witchcraft history in contemporary cultural productions, including novels, films, television programs, and tourist attractions, has created popular images of witches and witch hunting that often diverge significantly from historical reality, emphasizing dramatic elements like torture and mass burnings that were atypical of English prosecutions, while neglecting the more mundane social conflicts and legal procedures that characterized most cases. The appropriation of witch identity by contemporary Wiccan and neo-pagan movements created complex relationship with historical witchcraft, as modern witches claimed connection to historical accused witches while practicing forms of ritual magic and goddess worship that bore little resemblance to the village cunning craft and neighborhood malevolence that characterized early, modern English witchcraft beliefs. The feminist reclamation of witches as symbols of women's resistance to patriarchal oppression provided powerful political metaphor while sometimes obscuring historical complexity, as most accused witches did not understand themselves as rebels against patriarchy, but rather as victims of false accusations or practitioners of traditional magical services, while prosecution patterns reflected multiple factors beyond gender, including age, poverty, and social conflict. The scholarly debates about interpreting English witchcraft history continue to generate new insights and approaches, as historians apply anthropological theories, demographic analysis, microhistorical case studies, comparative methods, gender analysis, and interdisciplinary approaches to understanding why prosecutions occurred when and where they did, what social functions they served, and how witchcraft beliefs and prosecution practices changed over time. The accessibility of substantial documentary evidence about English witchcraft, including trial records, published pamphlets, theological treatises, personal correspondence, and administrative documents provides historians with unusually rich sources for analyzing beliefs, social dynamics, and prosecution processes. Though these sources reflect primarily literate elite perspectives and legal proceedings, while providing limited direct access to thoughts and motivations of accused witches and ordinary community members. The integration of archaeological evidence with documentary sources has enhanced understanding of magical practices and beliefs through discoveries of witch bottles, concealed objects, and ritual deposits that demonstrate material dimensions of protective magic and popular attempts to defend against perceived supernatural threats. While scientific analysis of supposed witches' remains has provided evidence about executed individuals' lives, health, and burial practices, the ethical implications of studying and presenting witchcraft history require sensitivity to the fact that prosecutions involved real human suffering, execution of hundreds of innocent people, destruction of families and communities, and perpetuation of beliefs that justified persecution of vulnerable individuals, while also recognizing value of understanding historical phenomena, however disturbing, and learning from past injustices to prevent similar persecution in different forms. The comparative perspective on English witchcraft prosecution within broader context of European and global witch hunting reveals both commonalities in how different societies identified and responded to perceived supernatural threats, and significant variations produced by specific legal traditions, religious frameworks, social structures, and political conditions, demonstrating that while witch hunting appeared across many societies, its particular manifestations depended crucially on local contexts. The legacy of English witchcraft prosecution extends beyond historical interest to raise enduring questions about how societies define and respond to deviance, how legal systems balance community protection against individual rights, how religious and scientific worldviews shape understanding of causation and evidence, and how social anxieties and conflicts find expression through identification and persecution of scapegoats. Questions that remain relevant despite the dramatic transformation of beliefs about supernatural causation over the past 3 centuries. The relationship between witch beliefs and actual practice of folk magic in early modern England reveals complex interactions, as some accused witches had indeed practiced forms of healing magic or cursing that they believed effective. Others were cunning folk, whose magical services attracted prosecution, while many accused persons had no involvement with magical practices, but were victims of neighbors' suspicions and accusations, demonstrating that categories of witch, magical practitioner, and innocent victim overlapped in complicated ways. The role of physical evidence in English witchcraft cases remained limited but symbolically important, as discovery of supposed witches' marks through intimate bodily searches, finding of clay images allegedly used for harmful magic, and observations of animals that might be familiar spirits, provided prosecutors with tangible evidence beyond purely testimonial accounts, though such evidence's interpretation depended entirely on assumptions about witchcraft's nature and Mark's significance that defendants could not effectively challenge. The medical and psychological dimensions of witchcraft accusations, including questions about whether accusers' reported symptoms resulted from genuine illness, psychosomatic processes, fraud, or actual malicious poisoning by accused witches, remain difficult to resolve, as historical distance prevents reliable diagnosis, while contemporary medical understanding suggests multiple possible explanations for reported phenomena, including epilepsy, mental illness, ergot poisoning, and mass psychogenic illness. The economic costs of witchcraft prosecution, including expenses for maintaining prisoners, conducting investigations, holding trials, paying officials and witnesses, and compensating witchfinders, represented significant burden on local communities and may have contributed to declining prosecution, as authorities recognized financial implications of pursuing cases, while accused witches and their families bore enormous costs through lost property, legal fees, and destruction of livelihoods, regardless of trial outcomes. The intersection of witchcraft prosecution with other forms of religious and social regulation, including prosecution of Catholics as potential traitors, suppression of Puritan nonconformity, and enforcement of sexual morality through church courts, created complex regulatory environment in which witchcraft accusations functioned alongside other mechanisms for maintaining religious orthodoxy and social order. The literary and cultural representations of witches in early modern England, including dramatic portrayals in Shakespeare's plays, sensational accounts in published pamphlets, theological discussions in sermons and treatises, and popular ballads and stories, shaped cultural imagination about witches' appearance, activities, and dangerousness, creating feedback loops between cultural representations and actual accusations, as people's expectations about witches influenced what they observed and reported. The survival of detailed trial records from some cases provides extraordinary insight into prosecution processes, witness testimony patterns, defendants' responses, and judicial reasoning, while cases lacking such documentation remain obscure, creating historical record bias toward exceptional or well-documented prosecutions, while typical cases left minimal traces. The psychology of witchcraft accusation, including accusers' motivations, their interpretation of misfortunes as evidence of magical harm, their willingness to pursue accusations that might result in neighbors' deaths, and their post-trial adjustments to having caused executions or to defendants' acquittals, reveals complex emotional and cognitive processes involving fear, guilt, anger, religious conviction, and community pressure. The theology of witchcraft prosecution, as articulated by learned proponents, emphasize biblical authority for punishing witches, theological understanding of Satan's role in human affairs, pastoral responsibility to protect communities from demonic threats, and sophisticated demonological theories about how witches acquired powers and what harms they could accomplish, creating intellectual framework that justified prosecution as religious duty rather than mere criminal law enforcement. The skeptical tradition in English thought about witchcraft, including Reginald Scott's discovery of witchcraft and subsequent critical works, questioned reality of witches' supposed powers, challenged reliability of evidence in witchcraft trials, warned against dangers of false accusation and wrongful execution, and offered alternative explanations for phenomena attributed to witchcraft, providing intellectual resources for those who doubted prosecution's wisdom. Though such skepticism remained minority position through most of prosecution period, the transformation of English culture from society that took witchcraft seriously as spiritual and criminal threat to modern secular society, where witchcraft claims seem absurd, represents one of most dramatic shifts in worldview and social practice over past 5 centuries, demonstrating how fundamentally collective beliefs about causation, evidence, and supernatural reality could change as intellectual frameworks, religious assumptions, and social conditions evolved. The study of English witchcraft history, therefore, illuminates not only specific historical phenomenon of early modern witch prosecution, but also broader processes of cultural change, the relationship between belief and practice, the power of religious and legal institutions to shape reality definitions, and the human tendency to explain suffering through identification of responsible agents, whether conceived as natural causes, supernatural forces, or malevolent individuals. Insights that retain relevance for understanding both historical developments and contemporary social dynamics in domains far removed from witchcraft itself.